whether you realize it or not, something is shaping you today. Um, is shaping the way you think. Is the people that you spend some time with, the things you watch, the conversations you have, the job that you got, the stress, the disappointments, even your victories. You know, every day something is influencing how you see the world, right? And here's the truth about that. If you're not intentional about who you are becoming, life will make that decision for you. And that's what we're talking about this morning. Um, making that decision, being intentional about it. Good morning. This is Thin Blue Faith. I'm Brett. I'm a retired North Carolina State Trooper. And every morning, weekday morning, 7 a.m., I get on here and read the Bible, and then we talk about it from a first responder point of view, if you will. All right. Today, we're going to read Romans chapter 12, verse 2. All right. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. And it says, do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is good and pleasing and the perfect will of God. Romans chapter 12, verse 2. You know, Paul wrote that, and he wrote it to believers that were living in a culture, that was constantly pulling them in different directions. It was a wild time back then. And you know what? Not much has changed. Every day we are surrounded by messages that tell us how to think, how to react, how do we measure success, how do we treat people, how do we define ourselves, you know, um, and Paul's warning about this is not just, hey, watch out what's influencing you, watch out for avoiding the bad ones there. You know, it's about recognizing that if we're not careful, we will slowly start to look like whatever we're surrounding ourselves by. And that's why this verse is still relevant today. All right. Think about it. Think about this now. You are being shaped every day. Every day you're on this earth. Most people think that, you know, growth only happens when they're intentionally working on themselves. You think, oh, that's it. But that's not true. You know, you're always being shaped. Every moment of every day, it's shaping you. Every conversation you have, every relationship you have, every experience, every habit, the disappointments, your successes. The question is not if you're being changed, but it's in what direction are you changing? Which way are you going? Because nobody stays exactly the same. Whether you're either becoming more patient or less patient, you're becoming more grateful or less grateful, more hopeful or more cynical, more compassionate or more hardened. And that process is happening whether we're paying attention to it or not. You know, are some ways that you think you've changed over the last 5 years? You think you've changed any? If you look at it as a whole, go back 5 years, do you think you've changed any? I venture to say you probably have. Where have you grown? Where have you fallen short? Think about that. Yeah. I got news for you guys. Your environment matters more than we realize. One reason that Paul was talking about conforming is because we naturally adapt to our environment. You know, you spend enough time around negativity, and that starts to feel normal. You spend enough time around anger, and it starts to influence you and how you respond. You spend enough time around cynicism, and eventually that stuff will start to sound like wisdom. You know, your environment around us matters. The environment around us matters. You know, now that doesn't mean that we are victims of our surrounding. That's not what I'm saying at all. All right. Um, but it does mean that we do need to be aware of them. You know, if don't you think that if we're in law enforcement, aren't we always trying to be situationally aware? You know, remember your tactics. Remember, hey, keep your head on a swivel. All that stuff. The same thing in life. We got to maintain. We got to be aware of our surroundings. See what is around us. See what is influencing us, whether it's people, places, or things, or whatever the case may be. We are, you know, um, we're constantly exposed to things that um, eventually, it influences how we think, you know, and how you think influences how we live. Does that make sense? We are influenced by things around us, and they influence how we think, and how we think influences how we live. Yep, there's a lot of truth in that one. You know, what's something in your environment that has had a bigger influence on you than you'd like to admit? I think if you think, as I think about it, I would say our television, the culture around that, and TV, and you know, those kind of things. Cat climbing a tree in the background, I can see. uh, but you know, that the world, it creeps into our lives through things like that, through the television, through the news, through social media now, you know, and it pushes us into different places. But transformation, it starts in the mind. You know, you know, notice when Paul was talking about that, he didn't start with the behavior. That's not what he mentioned first. He started with the mind. He said, "Hey, renew your mind." Why? Why would he do that? Because if you're going to make changes that last, that doesn't start with the actions. It starts with your thinking. Stinking thinking, as I heard a pastor say at one time. That's a bad thing, right? It begins with your thinking. And most people try to change their behavior without changing their mindset. And that rarely works right there. Very rarely you're going to change your behavior without changing your mindset. If you believe that you are defeated, then eventually you're going to act like you are defeated. If you believe that nothing's ever going to improve, nothing's ever going to get better, then eventually you're going to stop trying. If you believe that people cannot be trusted, you will build walls up all around yourself so that you're alone. The battle a lot of times is won or lost before the action ever happens. That's there's a lot of truth in that. I've seen that and you've probably heard in athletics, in sports. And man, I believe they were defeated before they ever took the field. They were defeated before they got in the ring. That's why a lot of, especially in the fight game, they try to do the mental part of it. They try to just get the people where they're intimidated before they ever get in the ring. And you can tell there's a difference in the fighter. Something's wrong with him. He's not the same fighter he was before. It's up here. Something's going on up here. That's a real thing. It starts with what we repeatedly tell ourselves. Folks, if you're saved, you're a child of the King. And you got to tell yourself that every day. Doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect. Doesn't mean everything's going to be wonderful. But that doesn't change who you are. You're a child of the King. And we need to act like it and think like it. You know, what thought pattern has had the biggest impact on your life? Positive or negative? You know people. You know people who think negatively. They don't ever. I've told y'all many times about my former coworker. Man, he was just a negative person. He thought everybody was against him, and in the end, he ended up basically alone. Built up walls around himself, and he was not a bad fellow. You know, like to think in a positive is making it through. How I made it through basic training, how you make it through patrol school, how you make it through those hard things. I'll quit tomorrow. Just won't do it today. You know, getting that, hey, I got to keep grinding. I've got to keep going. You know, that mindset, keeping it going. If you're just joining us, welcome. Today's message is very simple. We're just talking about that you are becoming something. You know, no matter what you're doing, you're becoming something. So the question is whether or not you're becoming that person that is in, if you are becoming that kind of person intentionally or accidentally. Which one is it? What are you doing? All right. Small changes, they do create big results. You know, most people overestimate what they can accomplish, you know, in a week and underestimate what they can accomplish in a year. We like to say, oh, we got big goals, but we want to make them short term. And our long term goals, we I don't know, you know, we just don't do it. We want dramatic change, and we want it immediately. We want immediate growth, instant transformation. Guys, that's rarely how it works. You know, most changes happen gradually. A new habit, you know, a better decision, you know, a healthier response, a different perspective, a mindset, you know, small choices that are repeated consistently create a major change over time. You know, the challenge is, you know, because the change is slow, people don't even notice that it's happening. You know, we don't think about it, but a drip of water over time, it'll change the earth up underneath it. But it doesn't happen quickly because it's just a drip. But that steady drip, man, it'll change. It'll start to move the earth up underneath it, you know. You know, but that slow drip, that slow change, one day they realize they're not the same person they used to be. And it can happen good or bad. And then you just wake up one day and say, how in the heck did I get here? How did I become this person right here? You know, what's one habit, a small habit that has had a surprisingly large impact on your life? What do you got? I think reading the Bible daily helps a lot. Helped me a lot. If you're in life and you're trying to do better, we try to say, oh man, I'm trying to do better. I want to talk to the Lord. I want to hear from him. Then start by reading his word. And it doesn't have, man, you don't have to read the whole thing in a day. Just start with, I recommend there's 31 proverbs. You read one proverb every day of the month and just go by the date. What is it? Today's the 15th. You read Proverbs chapter 15. I'm telling you, man, you would be amazed. Most of them are only around 20 to 30 verses. Won't take you 10 minutes to do it. And if you read Proverbs every day, there's a lot of wisdom in there. And out of that, if there's 30 verses, about 2 of them are going to hit. You're going to be like, dang, okay. The other 28 you probably won't remember, but there'd be 1 or 2 that it'll hit for you. For some reason, that day it'll hit for you. And you carry that, and the next day you do it again, and there's another verse. And the day after that. and it becomes a habit, and you build up that knowledge. And then the next month, when the 15th rolls around again, you read it again, and it'll be a different verse that'll hit in a different way. And then you're building your spiritual knowledge and your awareness. And the next thing you know, you've got a good habit. You started your mind fresh every day anew, and you're getting closer to God. And man, hey, next thing you know, that's a healthy habit, and you won't even realize the person that you were. Small habits make big changes over time. Excuse me. Right? You know, Becoming the person that God has created you to be requires you to be intentional. Nobody accidentally becomes who God wanted them to be, who He created them to be. Growth requires some attention. Um, it requires some honesty, some self-awareness. It requires you to be willing to elevate where you are and where you're headed. Because He's got plans for you. He's got something for you to do. It may not be, you may not be Billy Graham, but that doesn't mean you can't help people. That doesn't mean He doesn't have a plan for you. It requires you to be willing to elevate your thinking, elevate what you have your intentions on, because if you're not paying attention, life will have a way of pushing you to comfort instead of growth. And man, as human beings, that is natural for us. We love to be comfortable. I was just watching something a little while ago, and a guy was talking about that. He's talking, it's a men's ministry, and he was talking about most men are trapped by comfort. You're comfortable in your job. You're comfortable with, you're afraid to step out because you're very comfortable where we are. And I was like, man, that he was not wrong. Comfort, that's what it'll do. It'll push you, but life will also push you towards reactions instead of purpose. It'll push you towards survival instead of transformation. And that's not what God wants for you. God is not interested in He's not just interested in where you're going. He's interested in who you become along the way. Who do you want to be in a year? Who do you want to become in a year? And what changes do you need to make right now, today, so that you can be that person in a year? Think about it. I've got to think about that thing. I'm not sure about that. I want to continue on my journey here, but I want to be a good granddaddy. I've got two grandsons now, and I want to lead them in a godly manner. So I've got to think about what habits can I have that can lead me to be that person that I want to be in 12 months. Excuse me. One of the most important questions that you will ever ask is, what do I want to accomplish? Most people think that, but I think a more important one is this: who am I becoming? Because accomplishments, they come and go. Your title can change, positions change, circumstances change, right? But character stays with you. And every day, through, every challenge and every opportunity, you are becoming someone. So, this week, it's Monday. We're going to start at this week right here. I want you to pay attention. Pay attention to what it is that's feeding your mind. Pay attention to what's influencing your thinking. Pay attention to who you're becoming, because the person that you become is ultimately more important than anything you can achieve. All right, guys. I love you. God's got you six. Now let's get to work. See y'all in the morning.